Stereotypes have always existed in our society's mass media, whether they are racial, gender, religious, or political. Generally, concerning gender portrayals in various kinds of mass media, males have appeared much more often than females overall. Although we have come a long way from women only being depicted as the damsels in distress, men are still characterized by greater leadership roles. While these stereotypes formerly were only illustrated through radio, advertisements, news, and television, today it is also through video games. The issue of violence in video games is a much talked about topic, but the problem of sexualized stereotypes regarding women is often overlooked completely. Playing the video games with a theme of female objectification and a portrayal of women in a sexualized stereotype causes males' chauvinistic behaviors to become magnified, as well as females' levels of self-efficacy to become lower. Ever since the first video game appeared on the market in the 1970s, stereotypes have existed within them. Video game creators almost always aim their games to appeal to a male audience. This is apparent through the fact that only 10 to 14% of the main characters in games are women. Unfortunately, despite the recent growth spurt of women making and playing video games, there remains a great divide between male and female gamers. Not only is the gender ratio regarding players changing, but also the gap concerning the creators of the video games. More women are designing and creating the video games that we see on the market today. As the gender ratio between males and females is altered to an even greater extent, there is bound to be even more criticism toward the way the majority of female characters are portrayed within today's most popular video games. When the first video games were created, they were so basic that gender stereotyping was not an issue because the characters had no gender. Games including Space Invaders and Asteroids, which were released in the late 1970s, had no characters of a particular gender or race. The very first female character in a game was Ms. Pac-Man, a runoff of the original Pac-Man. Things changed, however, when Nintendo released Donkey Kong in 1981 with the original damsel in distress, Lady. The entire point of the game was for the player, as Mario, to defeat Donkey Kong and rescue Lady from him. Donkey Kong's main theme of rescuing the damsel in distress can be found in a multitude of other games from the same time period, whether it was Mario and Luigi rescuing Princess Toadstool or Link having to wake up Zelda. Video gaming eventually evolved from the arcade to being played at home. RPG and adventure games became increasingly popular. During this time, it was very common for women to actually hold many main character roles in video games. For example, Phantasy Star had a female lead, Alice Landell, where in Wizardry, players were able to create their own character control while choosing their gender, race, and class. Next in the evolution of women in video games is the first sex symbol in video games, Lara Croft in Tomb Raiders. Lara Croft altered female representation in video games to helping market games through sexual appeal and prove that sex is what sells. However, the object of sex in video games was taken up a level, which can be seen through the Grand Theft Auto series. For example, in Grand Theft Auto 3, prostitutes could be seen on the streets. Today, a very large percentage of women in video games are objectified female characters. Many would say that all of these things have little consequences other than the selling of more video games, but the reality is that having video games with the theme of female objectification has many negative effects on both males and females. The portrayal of women in video games in a sexualized stereotype has many effects on males and their views and treatment of women. The stereotypes of women in video games influence how adolescent men form their own identity and attitudes towards the opposite gender. First of all, the vast majority of video games have male as the aggressive main character, while most of the female characters are in a more weak or submissive role. In fact, 80% of male characters are represented as active and violent, while most female characters are portrayed simply as sex objects. This creates the idea of hypermasculinity and male dominance. Hypermasculine or macho males were found to be more accepting of callous sexual interaction and of coercive sex. Men who had these traits were then discovered to be more likely to partake in sexual aggression towards a woman. Video games with female characters and sexualized roles do more than just affect males' views of females, but help to condone violence against women as well. For example, in one of the most well-known video game franchises, Grand Theft Auto, men are usually represented as thugs and women as prostitutes. This is illustrated by the option the player has to have sex with a prostitute and then kill her in a number of ways, including beating her to death with a golf club, kicking her in the crotch until she bleeds to death, or shooting her. If he does any of these things, he gets the money back he gave to the prostitute, thus earning a reward for his violence. Games like this condone violence against women by men. Through a study by Karen Dill and her colleagues, it was found that males who played games with stereotypical characters express more tolerance of sexual harassment than men exposed to non-stereotyped portrayals. The effect of degrading portrayals like this one can be illustrated through Dill's study once again. It was found that playing video games with violence against women can be linked to rape myth acceptance, which is the idea that many men have that women who wear more revealing outfits, flirt, or are prostitutes are practically asking to be raped and therefore hold some blame for it. Negatively sexualized female stereotypes in video games don't only have an influence on the males that play the games, but also impact female gamers in a great number of ways. Recently, the ideal beauty for females has been described as curvaceously thin. Through Kristen Harrison's research and study, she found that exposure to both males and females to curvaceously thin women resulted in both sexes viewing the overly perfect body type as ideal. This also led to greater approval and acceptance of the use of cosmetic surgery. A woman's desire to be thin and beautiful can sometimes even lead to an eating disorder such as bulimia or anorexia. However, it is more than the shape of female characters' bodies that are having an effect. Highly revealing clothing accentuates female video game characters' promiscuous and curvaceously thin bodies. This too contributes to women's self-concept and how women view themselves and their worth. Not only is a woman's body image influenced by negative female stereotypes in video games, but also a woman's self-image. Through various studies, it has been found that exposure to idealized images of the female body has been shown to negatively affect girls' and women's general feelings of self-worth. The impact on self-esteem is best illustrated by the findings of Funk and Buchman. They studied how girls' self-esteem was influenced by video game play. From their investigation on adolescent self-concept, they discovered that playing video games is negatively associated with girls' self-esteem. Female self-efficacy can be defined as their belief in their ability to accomplish things in life. A decrease in women's self-efficacy because of exposure to stereotypical female characters can, in part, be construed by research that helps support the idea that negative female stereotypes are directly related to the depreciation of women's self-efficacy. It is quite clear that there is a large amount of evidence supporting the negative impact of the theme of female objectification in video games, but there are many video game creators, critics, and enthusiasts who would disagree with the argument that stereotypical or sexualized representations of women in video games have negative repercussions. Firstly, many people may present the argument that these sexualized roles regarding females are mere entertainment or harmless fun. Additionally, many have argued plain and simple that sex sells. This particular claim is perhaps all too true. This can be most easily illustrated through advertisements in all sorts of media. One more counter-argument is the belief that many have in the fact that parents or guardians should control what their children are being exposed to, regarding forms of media and entertainment. Simply put, if parents don't want their children to be affected by the negative aspects of video games like violence and stereotyping, it is their responsibility to regulate what their children have accessible to them. These various counter-arguments may be supported by a large number of people. However, there is scientific evidence that connotes the fact that negative stereotyping in video games is much more than just harmless fun, and that there are both short-term and long-term effects from exposure to stereotyped and sexualized representations of women. Also, of course sex sells, but sometimes it shouldn't. When children and adolescents are the possible audience for a video game that has sexualized and degrading stereotypes of women, there is way too much evidence that shows the ways in which they can be impacted by it. Also, video game creators should remember that the percentage of their female audience is growing. With this in mind, they should realize that derogatory female roles are not something that would attract the average American woman to play a video game. Lastly, children, and especially those that are teenagers, are most likely going to be able to access the television and games that have violent and sexualized themes, no matter how much their parents try to regulate what they watch and play. Parents can't control everything their children do when they are not at home. The use of female stereotypes such as these impact both men and women in different ways. The theme of female objectification can cause men to have greater rape myth acceptance, think of women in a more sexualized manner, and view females as sex objects. Women and girls who are exposed to overly sexualized female stereotypes in video games are more likely to have lower self-esteem and view those curvaceously thin and promiscuous bodies as ideal, which can lead to bad body image and a greater likelihood to get plastic surgery or have an eating disorder. Female video game characters in compliant secondary roles have effects on both men and women as well. Video games with submissive female roles magnify men's perception of male dominance and hypermasculinity. Women are impacted by this stereotype by having worse self-image and lower self-efficacy, confidence, and self-worth. There's evidence that supports the argument that playing video games that contain sexualized or disempowered female roles results in women's self-esteem and confidence to depreciate, as well as men's views and behaviors regarding women to change negatively.